Good afternoon from Purdue University in the CERIAS Security Seminar. Our speaker today is Morgan Greenwood. He's a senior software engineer with Raytheon Corporation. And his topic today is this product that they offer, SureView AMP, anti-malware protection. Morgan?
Thanks, Dave. First of all, it's great to be here at Purdue. The staff's been really warm and welcoming and accommodating, and it's been a great experience, and I'm really excited to be able to speak with you guys today. Just a little bit of background information on me. I've been a software engineer for about 12 years. I've done a wide array of projects, all the way from embedded wireless mesh networking all the way up through C, C++, Java, scripting languages, you name it. I've been involved with it. Most recently, I have been involved in this AMP project, or AMP as we like to call it. I actually was on the team that designed and implemented the SureView product, which AMP is built on top of, and I also have been doing a lot of malware reversing and analysis. So, to get started, I have a scenario here that I like to call a bad day, and it starts out, so you're out of country on business. Now this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but you are partially, depending on where you are and where you're traveling, you're partially removed from corporate support and IT security and even the IT help desk, so you're a little bit out on your own if anything happens to go wrong. But you have followed all the procedures and policies set in place by your security department, and one thing leads to another, and your laptop gets infected, and this is where the day starts getting bad. Now, not only is your laptop infected, but you don't know it because your antivirus solution did not catch it, and that's a really bad day. Now, having a virus infection in itself is bad enough, but depending on where you are and who your client or your customer might be, if you ended up infecting them, then your intent might be called into question. Was it malicious behavior? Was it accidental? So on and so forth. So, and especially if you're dealing with a foreign government or another nation state, it can get very bad very quickly. So I would like you to kind of put this idea of a bad day in your back of your mind, and I would like to take a few minutes and kind of talk about the problem space a little bit and how SureView was designed to protect against behavioral-based attacks, and then more specifically how this AMP project combats the malware issue directly. So, what is the problem? Well, the short answer to the problem is cyber threats, and they can basically enter your organization through all kinds of vectors. A lot of those you can see listed up on the slide. Some interesting statistics, and this is more related to insider threat, but it also applies to malware and the threat it poses. A 2008 CyberArk study found that 59% of employees who lost their jobs or left their jobs took electronic versions of proprietary information with them. That number is actually a lot higher now, especially with the recession that the country's been facing and the number of layoffs and the unemployment rate. There was a 2001 search study. The state's many insiders usually steal information within 30 days before their termination. So if you give the heads up to your employees, hey, sorry, there's going to be a reduction in force in 45 days, there's a good chance that there's going to be some information walking out the door. This one shocked myself when I first ran across it. 88% of IT administrators in the same CyberArk study said they would take data if they were laid off or fired. So the IT administrators, the guys protecting your infrastructure, and for some reason they feel it's job security or vindication or whatever their intent may be, they're going to take some information with them. An Ira Winkler study in the same year found that firms lose over $100 billion from corporate spies, and today that number is even higher. It's becoming more and more cost effective, unfortunately, to go steal secrets or intellectual property than it is to put the R&D dollars into it. The federal government spends $7.9 billion annually on sophisticated cybersecurity measures. I know that's a broad term, but it's still a large money figure. Data breaches end up costing organizations billions of dollars each year. And in the case of the federal government, these breaches can be direct national security threats, depending on the type of information that happened to be breached. As we all know, an organization's intellectual property, including its discoveries, its inventions, trademarks, patents, trade secrets, that's your lifeblood. If that goes out the door, you can easily go out of business. And I know none of this is going to be real news to anyone. I'm just trying to lay a little landscape out there for you. Cyber threats that are designed to steal intellectual property find their way into organization through all these vectors that you see. But the root of all of these isn't necessarily the technique or the type of breach. It is the root of it all is human behavior. A human decided to act and through whatever means breached whatever defenses you had and removed information. According to a 2010 Cybersecurity Watch survey, it was sponsored by CSO Magazine, the U.S. Secret Service, CERT, and Deloitte. They claim it's alarming that although most of the top 15 security policies and procedures from the survey are aimed at preventing insider attacks, 51% of the respondents experienced a cybersecurity event and were still victims of an insider threat. So they basically did this big study and said, what are your policies and procedures that you've put into place to protect yourself from data going out the door? And they listed off 15 best practices that companies adopted, and just barely over half of them still experienced data leakage and data loss. Sorry about that. Just a couple more statistics. I know they're a bit boring. In the same study, 32% of the survey's respondents now monitor online activities of employees, and it's even gone up in the face of the recession we're in. And finally, 72% of events perpetrated by insiders were handled internally without any legal or law enforcement involvement. And that number in itself is kind of fuzzy. A lot of times when you get breached, you don't go make a press release, hey, we got breached. It's usually bad for business, and it's usually handled internally. So these are the best numbers we really have to kind of give the scope and size of the problem, the insider threat. And so to kind of support what I've been saying, it's just not a problem that we've invented or that we've pushed out there or we're trying to sell a product on top of. Just last month there was a presidential executive order signed by President Obama, 13587, entitled Structural Reforms to Improve the Security of Classified Networks and Responsible Sharing and Safeguarding of Classified Information. So executive order titles are always long and boring, but basically the executive in chief is mandating that some sort of insider threat, and more than just an insider threat, some sort of solution needs to be deployed to all U.S. government employees to combat this problem. So corporations recognize this problem, the United States recognizes this problem, and obviously other countries recognize this problem as well. You may have heard this quote before by President Barack Obama. He said, "In today's world, acts of terror could come not only from a few extremists in suicide vests, but a few keystrokes on the computer, a weapon of mass destruction." Also, U.S. General Keith Alexander is the commander of the newly formed U.S. Cybercom and the former director of the NSA, or I believe current director of the NSA, said, "We in the Department of Defense have more than 7 million machines to protect, links in 15,000 networks with 21 satellite gateways and 20,000 commercial circuits comprised of countless devices and components. DoD systems are probed by unauthorized users approximately 250,000 times an hour, or over 6 million times a day." So there's definitely the insider threat, but there's definitely people are knocking at the door and seeing what they can get out. So how does Raytheon's SureView product protect from the insider threat, and then we'll talk about how it also can protect from outsider threats and malware. So basically, we analyze human behavior to fight the insider threat, and this kind of sets us apart from most DLP solutions, which are either some kind of log aggregation that requires an IT expert to go through and not only locate but piece together disparate pieces of information to actually form a case. The SureView product actually takes a lot of that out, and this analysis can provide clues leading up to a breach that are technically observable, including intent, kind of going down the slide, behavioral changes, precursors, and finally the acts themselves. SureView detects warning signs including policy violations, compliance incidents, or malicious acts. For example, if an employee were planning to leave the company, they might search the web or post their resume on a job site, and with the knowledge that 59% of your employees are going to take data out the door with them, it might be a good idea to maybe put that employee into a higher monitoring group to keep a closer eye on them. SureView has been securing some of the most critical and classified networks from internal leaks, compromise, and malicious attacks, both in the federal government space and Fortune 100 organizations for nearly a decade. So here's a kind of a quick overview of how SureView is deployed and its not really its architecture, but how it protects your enterprise. So up on the slide you can see that could be your whole organization, it could be a part of your organization, it could be a government organization. So somewhere you're going to have a security operations center, hopefully, if you have any kind of security practices, and you can install SureView into there, your SureView server into there. And obviously your enterprise is going to have assets both behind probably a well monitored and protected perimeter by firewalls and IDS and all the tricks and trades of the tool today. But there's also this ever increasing mobile workforce where they get outside of that protective barrier. For example, the guy that went to other countries, obviously outside of that protected barrier. And so security needs to start moving closer and closer and closer to the data that it needs to protect, or the asset it needs to protect. And this applies as well to as our computing experience moves into the cloud. Security needs to become closer and closer to the data. So we have SureView deployed in our NOC or our SOC, and we have our endpoints no matter where they may be. And so the first thing we'll do is we will deploy an endpoint agent. So it is an endpoint solution to all our assets. And along with that deployment, we're going to push out a policy, and the policy is going to be defined by your business practices, and the tool allows you to define policy based on your business practices, and I'll go over that in a little bit more detail in a second. So something happens on one of these machines, you have an agent, and an alert is sent back to your operations center or your monitoring center, and not only the whatever you, depending on how you define that policy, you also define what data comes back with it, whether it's just the event itself or metadata surrounding the event, up to and including video replay. And finally, the operator reviews the alerts and takes the appropriate remediation action. So the nice thing about this is, for example, let's say Joe decides to send your organization trade secrets. He puts them in email and sends them outside the company. Regardless of intent, he just violated your company policy. So you already had a policy in place looking for sensitive data leaving your organization. So Kevin, who's sitting in the SOC, gets an alert, and he's able to dig down, contextually look at what was happening before and what was happening after, determine the intent, and then determine the appropriate response. And responses can range from maybe it was accidental, or you need better training or teaching for your employees, all the way up to this was a malicious activity. He was trying to exfiltrate data from that company, and so the appropriate action to be taken in that case. And the nice thing about that over-the-shoulder DVR view is it gives you kind of a lot of extra contextual information that maybe you weren't targeting with your policy, but it really goes towards intent, which, like I just mentioned, goes towards the remediation you're going to choose. So the benefits of monitoring human behavior is that the SureView can provide your organization with all the details, the insight, and the complete context to immediately assess the severity of threat, fix the problem, and build new or perhaps additional policies to defend against this or to prevent this from happening in the future. It takes the guesswork out of it by aggregating all this information from the user desktop to the analysts in real time without having to go get through a bunch of logs and try to start putting pieces of data together. Your policy was doing that for you automatically. It was monitoring this behavior, that behavior, and the culmination of the policy that resulted in a trigger being fired. You already know what behavior you're looking at. Now you're trying to determine damage, intent, so on and so forth. Because of the replay feature, culprits can't hide. The best way to really describe that is, I accidentally clicked on that link. I didn't mean to send that out. That well may be untrue, but now you actually have the proof, or to either back up their statement or to counter their statement. Finally, it provides you a proactive solution versus a reactive solution. It enables your organization to identify and improve breakdowns in business practices and policies. As I mentioned before, your policies should be developed after your business practices. SureView helps companies measure the effectiveness of these business processes and policies. They provide a return on investments for security processes and policy by making it possible to quantify business practices. In this case, you may or may not be able to assign a dollar amount to that document that was leaked, but you definitely there was a loss, and depending on what was leaked, you can start quantifying how much did this breach cost me, how much did this data leak cost me, so on and so forth. And not only that, it's a very iterative process of deploying these policies because every company's business practices are a little bit different. And so you can custom tailor these policies and make them as fine-grained as you'd like to not only align with your business policies or your government policies or whatever compliance policies you're trying to enforce with this, but it also lets you see where those policies break down and take the appropriate measures. So I know up until this point I've talked a lot about how SureView, the product, can combat the insider threat. Now I would like to get in the meat of my presentation and talk about how about a year or so ago, the question was posed to us, okay, so we have this capability to monitor user behavior. Can we monitor malicious behavior? And at first, we thought it was definitely possible. We weren't sure, so we decided to give it a try, and I'm excited to share some of those results with you today. So just like SureView was designed to monitor our human behaviors, we turned around and we leveraged that capability to monitor malware behavior. So SureView AMP. What is SureView AMP? So it is the exact same endpoint agent. It is the exact same back-end infrastructure. It's the exact same investigative tool that the analysts would be using. It's simply a new policy set. It's targeting a different type of behavior. Basically, it's targeting system anomalous behavior that we know can be attributed to malware or malicious software. A lot of times, the insider threat and malware is one's handled by the IT department and one's handled by the information assurance department, and depending on if you're a company or a government agency, those can be widely separated and have different missions. One way of viewing an external attack, especially in the case of an advanced persistent threat type attack, is an external attack can be an insider threat. The bad actor is simply using an internal asset as a proxy to exfiltrate target information of value. So that kind of hit home for me, when I was trying to reconcile the difference between the two, we're in a traditional human behavior inside our threat scope, and simply by changing what we were looking for, we can completely change what type of product this is capable of becoming. So, as I said, we're a behavior-based approach, and an easy way to compare and contrast this is with the traditional signature-based approach employed by your traditional antivirus solutions, and even some of your IDS and other types of monitoring. And put a little preface on here. I don't want to come off sounding like I'm bashing signature-based detection. There is a place for it, and I think both signature and behavior type detection capabilities complement each other very well. I mean, I would definitely not advocate throwing away your AV solution. It's going to catch a lot of your low-lying fruit. A lot of your less sophisticated malware is going to be picked up by it, and it does definitely provide a layer of security at a very cost-effective price point. So some issues with signature detection. So we need to see a sample first. This means, unfortunately, someone's been infected. Hopefully it's not anyone in your organization. But before you can respond to the threat has to be seen and it has to be signaturized. And malware authors are well aware of this. And so as a result, virus definitions need to be continually updated for many reasons. New threats are emerging. Existing threats get re-encrypted, redistributed, re-put together with another piece of malware. Variants of the same worm or virus or piece of malware all need to have a new signature, so you're constantly having to push out signature updates. And so if you miss a signature update, and if you're managing tens or even hundreds of thousands of systems, there's just always going to be a certain percentage that aren't up to date and therefore aren't protected. Secondly, it has surprisingly low detection rates, and that's kind of the model of traditional signature-based. Is they want to make sure they're absolutely sure that something is malicious. They don't want to introduce noise into your security operations channel. In unsophisticated traditional malware type attacks, if the signal-to-noise ratio becomes too high, then you'll either go adopt another antivirus solution or you'll drop it completely, which leaves you even less protected than you were before. So this really was surprising to me. When I do my malware analysis and reverse engineering, is I'll have a sample and I'll submit it to one of the online sites that will run it through pretty much every AV vendor's engine, and maybe 50–40% of them will come back and at least tell me this is a virus, and the remainder aren't even aware of it. And what's really scary is a lot of the times, if you take the big 3 or 4 names and whatever you consider the 3 big or 4 AV vendors are out there, vendor A will detect it and vendor B won't detect it. And every organization I've ever seen, I've only ever seen one AV solution pushed out to the enterprise. I've never seen anyone push out 30 different AV clients to a box. So it kind of gives you a slight feeling of being protected when you aren't necessarily completely protected. And they also, since they err on the side of lower false positive rate, they actually have a higher false negative rate. Another way saying that is they're letting malware through and not alerting you to it because they weren't 100% sure of it. And to me, letting the malware through, and there's the business case that I mentioned before, but from a malware analysis point of view, the fact that it got through can have much more dire consequences than having a higher false positive rate and actually catching some more malware. So, and it's also susceptible to morphic malware. So most malware these days, I mean, it's hard to find a sample that's either not poly, oligo, or metamorphic, and this again thwarts signature-based detection. Just quickly, polymorphic software is the same code that takes many forms. So I took a piece of malware and I encrypted it X number of times. Or I used encryption in one case and I didn't use in another case. Or there's just a few variants of the same word out there obfuscated a few different ways. So I need a signature for each one of those. Oligomorphic software, it's the same piece of code with a few predefined forms. So it's pretty similar to polymorphic code, but most viruses, well, most more sophisticated viruses, I should say, are metamorphic, and basically they mutate each time they run. So they look different every time they run to the AV engine, the signature type engines, and you obviously you can quickly see how you couldn't keep up with a metamorphic virus with a signature-based approach. So bottom line, it doesn't matter how morphic piece of malware is. At the end of the day, it always outputs malware and it always behaves like malware. And antivirus vendors were aware of these obfuscation, specifically these and other obfuscation techniques as early as 2003. There was a paper published by Symantec called Hunting for Metamorphic. And they recognize it, but their approach is still let the malware run to a certain point or analyze it at a certain time in its life cycle or a different area. They're still trying to turn around and apply a signature maybe at a different time or a different place to detect the malware, and it still fails for the same reasons mentioned before. And high quality malware, it goes through a QA cycle just like any software product does, and part of that QA cycle happens to be running it against the antivirus solutions out there. So they do their due diligence. Malware authors definitely do their due diligence. Then this is just an example way malware can avoid signature detection. So AMP is behavior-based detection, or more specifically, it's anomaly-based detection. So through research and domain knowledge, we look to detect behavior that a system would allow, but an end user normally probably wouldn't be doing. So that's where the anomaly detection comes in. Finally, I found this interesting. There's a security researcher from Google. His name's Tavis Ormandy. And at Black Hat this year, he gave a presentation, and instead of reverse engineering the latest, greatest piece of malware and how subversive it was and the cool and interesting techniques it did, he decided to take an AV engine, I'm not sure which one, and reverse engineer that. And some of his findings were pretty startling. One, and it's not so technical, but you have a kind of a lack of transparency when you buy an AV solution off the shelf. It's essentially a black box to your computer. You don't know what exactly is going on inside that box. You don't know what it's detecting. Well, you know what it's detecting on, but you don't know what it's not detecting on, or why it's throwing out a sample, or why it's failing to quarantine a sample if it fails to quarantine example. So you really are putting, in a lot of cases, more trust into your AV solution than you might even realize on the outset. There's also a lack of technical details. Like I said, you don't know exactly how they're doing it. So in order to answer some of these questions, he reverse engineered an AV engine. And the things that stuck out the most to me were he called some of the way they implemented some of the features actually had security vulnerabilities in themselves. So the actual product you've deployed to protect yourself just expanded your threat surface, and now you're more susceptible to certain types of attacks. Again, not a reason to not deploy AV, but an interesting point nonetheless. And the scary part about this attack surface, if you're familiar with AV technology, is they hook in at really low levels to do what they need to do. And so by expanding the attack surface, they provide really low level, hard to detect ways that a rootkit or malware could get installed on your machine. They use CRC32, cyclic redundancy checking, 32-bit signature matching on dead or relevant pieces of code. So the 2 points in there are if maybe they used a hashing algorithm with a lower collision rate, MD5 SHA-1, they could get around some of that. But the fact that they're matching on dead or irrelevant code, if the code never runs, even if it's in a piece of malware, it's not a threat to your computer. And finally, he described what he called weak runtime exploit mitigation and cryptography. So there's possibility of during an upgrade cycle, someone getting a man in the mirroring you down, either phony definitions or saying that you got the latest definitions when you really didn't, or removed signatures for their attack from your AV solution. And my work in reverse engineering analysis of malware. Malware is small, it hates to be seen, it has a small footprint, and one of the first things sophisticated malware at least goes after is detecting if you are running antivirus and then deactivating it. So so those are some issues with some current AV technology. So what are the types of behavior that AMP policies are meant to detect? Well, we came up with 3 initially, and basically all malware needs to exhibit one of these types of behavior, either execution, persistence, or propagation. Hopefully these are all familiar to you, but execution asks the question, how do I run? And it might seem like a silly question at first, but it goes to, am I running from a strange place, or am I injected into a piece of code, or did I use an exploit to run, or did I use some backdoor or some less used feature of the operating system to run? So there's a lot of different ways that malware will try to get itself to run and not just try to attack you or attack a vulnerability. Persistence, this is a huge one. How do I ensure I run each boot? Malware wants to make sure that every time you turn on your computer, or every time or all the time that your computer is on, that it's running, that it can send out to its command and control channel if it needs to. It can receive instructions, and we've seen things that start out as worms all of a sudden become Trojans, all of a sudden become rats. So malware definitely wants to make sure it's running. And finally, propagation. How do I spread? They call them viruses for a reason. One of the first things malware tries to do is spread. It wants to live on more than one system, because if you can identify, if they can affect 100 systems and you identify 10, they still have 90 ways into your organization. And those are the kind of numbers they play with. Especially in more advanced types of malware. They'll do their reconnaissance phase on your organization, and then if they determine that they need 100 or however many machines they need to do their infiltration and their exfiltration, they usually will do either a factor of 10 to 100 of compromises to ensure that they have that communication channel open and that they have many backup options that they can quickly turn to if needed. So since we're targeting malware behaviors or combinations thereof, and we are agnostic to the type of threat. This is and what the good thing about this is different types of threats use the same techniques, tactics, and practices, just recombined in different ways. So your little script kiddie might have used one exploit that turns in to be the same exploit used in some piece of an advanced persistent threat, or anywhere throughout the whole spectrum. So there's a lot of code sharing. Once you get a command and control channel or protocol established, and especially if it's a secure one, if it uses encryption, that gets reused a lot. And recently Mandiant was here speaking to you guys, and they did a really good job of covering the threat spectrum and the different actors and their motivations, starting all the way from the script kiddie who's just kind of curious and what can this do, and I found this and it's interesting, maybe up to the hacktivists, the lulsecs, the anonymouses, where they're trying to make a statement. They're really not after anything more than attention or their agenda, all the way up through organized crime and how they use worms and botnets to not only target people and their money, but banks and financial institutions and their money, all the way up to stuff that we face in in the defense industrial space and the government space, the advanced persistent threat, where multiple people collude together in a fashion to, in a long-term fashion usually, to infiltrate your organization and then extract as much data as they need to. And the thing about the advanced persistent threat is that kind of sets them apart from everyone else is they're really not in a hurry. They'll do a recon phase or many recon phases if necessary to figure out what they need to do next. And then they'll pull back a little bit of data and they'll do some analysis on it. And they'll go back and forth and they'll take their time and they'll do their research. They'll find vulnerabilities specific to your organization and they'll turn around and either use custom exploits or reuse exploits targeted at those specific vulnerabilities. And finally, they usually have very well thought out exfiltration policies. They usually will aggregate a bunch of data together onto a server, and then, like all good, security practice or server practices, they'll make redundant copies of that data after they have compressed and encrypted it, and then they'll slowly start leaking the information of value out of your organization. So they're very patient and very nefarious in that respect. So they're kind of the slow type of a burglar, where some of your less sophisticated type malware is more your smash and grab. They don't really care if they set off the AV. They don't really care if you know that they were there. They're already gone. They took what they can, and if there's value in it, they'll use it to their advantage. If not, they'll just move on to the next target. All right, so what does it mean to be threat type agnostic? Basically, we're we are equal opportunity detection. If you're going to use the same persistent mechanism or persistence mechanism or propagation mechanism, that's on another piece of malware that we've seen or that we're aware of or that we've researched or from whatever channel we get our intel from, we'll capture that. So we have the potential to capture from the entire threat spectrum, and I believe we've pretty much seen the entire threat spectrum through this AMP product offering. So policy is based on known malware, not theory or speculation. We work really closely with our cyber security operations and share information intelligence about and research on our own. So we don't have a bunch of guys sitting in a room thinking, ooh, malware could do this, or wouldn't it be evil if it did that? We actually go and say, what are we seeing? And then we'll do a decomposition, a behavioral decomposition on that malware and develop a corpus and see where the similarities are, and policy comes out of those ideas. So there's some inherent features in the SureView product that we were able to leverage in new and interesting ways by putting this different policy set out there that's not necessarily looking for human behavior and intent, but looking for malware behavior and intent. So one of the abilities I mentioned earlier is we have the ability to collect not only data surrounding the violation, but metadata, associated data, time-bound data, and video replay. You might ask, what good is video replay going to be doing in malware, in a malware type situation? Normally when you think of malware, it's a process running in the background, it doesn't have a window, users are usually not aware of it unless it's causing some kind of performance degradation on their machine. Well, Microsoft published this year, and they do a biannual report, a security, basically state of security report, and I want to say 46% in that neighborhood of initial attack vectors were, I got an email and there was a juicy link in there and I clicked on it, or I was on a social feed and there was an obfuscated link that had been shortened down to fit into 140 characters they allow me. And I clicked on that and it was bait and I was caught and I wasn't even aware of it. Another feature that was already in SureView that can aid in malware detection and remediation is it can significantly reduce the total remediation time. Basically, so one of the things we can collect, depending on the policy, is the actual malware sample. And if it's a new sample or a sample that wasn't detected by traditional means, the quicker you can get that sample into your forensics hands, the quicker they can come up with some type of remediation or protection from it, and the quicker they can get it deployed. So especially like in the case of a worm, for example, where its primary objective is to spread and propagate, and then start communicating out and say, tell me more, tell me what to do. The quicker you can remediate that threat, you can stop a worm from, or you can prevent a worm from becoming an unmanageable problem. Another thing is SureView is always running. Once you install it on a corporate asset like a laptop, even if that asset's not plugged into the corporate network, it's still protected. Those policies are still running. It's still detecting those behaviors. It's still collecting that information, and still being monitored. And as soon as you do phone home, for lack of a better term, all that information is then presented to your SOC in the format we talked about before. That's easy to understand and digest and understand what's going on. Some of our policies generate more noise than others just because some discriminators are harder to define in a fine-grained control, or we're early on in a policy development cycle where we've seen a particular behavior and we've written a policy for it, but we haven't seen the side effects or the unintended consequences of what else it's catching that's legitimate behavior. And so we have this investigation workbench that has capabilities to quickly narrow down through large data sets to find those anomalies. So I could be looking at a few thousand alerts based on a certain policy and sort it a couple different ways, and all of a sudden notice that why did this policy trigger on Notepad? Notepad's a pretty benign program. Why is Notepad connecting out to the internet? I didn't know Notepad could connect out to the internet. You can use the workbench to narrow down a lot of the data to find the anomalies. And finally, if you know that there's an area or a behavior that happens that you need, but there's a lot of noise in that same channel, there's a reporting feature built into SureView that lets you run choose whatever analytics you want and choose whatever queries you want to run. So you can do anomaly-based detection over time, and all of a sudden what was lost potentially in the noise all of a sudden pops out in a report, and you can go act upon it in the same manner. You can go take it from the report back into the product itself and view the replay, get all the juicy pieces of data, and use all the features. So during roughly a 3-month pilot at a customer site, we observed the following results. 26 malicious files were detected. 12 were undetected by traditional defenses, whether that be AV, IDS, whatever they had deployed, it made it through. Not surprisingly, based on what we talked about before. 4 of these files were actually submitted to AV vendors for definition updates. And they observed a previously undiscovered rootkit variant. So I'd like to talk about that last one a little bit, since it's probably the most exciting bullet point on that slide. So what happened? So AMP had a policy that detected known worm behavior, and this particular virus worm was undetected by traditional antivirus solution that was deployed, and so they were able to remediate this in 24 hours. 37 days later, they discovered it was the new next great version of the TDSS rootkit, or TDL version 4, had decided to, as part of its upgrade and new feature set, it was going to add some worm-like propagation techniques. Well, since we already knew this was a typical behavior of malware, we already had a policy for it. So even before these authors had put this capability into their malware, this customer was defended against it proactively. So that goes right into the next point. How do we do this? Proactive defense. So again, AMP policies are not based on signatures, but based on how malware behaves. So this allows us to detect malware before we have the indicators. We don't have to signaturize it. And AMP will continue to provide malware discoveries and similar zero-day events. So some benefits that our customers observe from using behavioral malware detection alongside their traditional signature-based detection. It literally can reduce your investigation time from days to hours. A lot of times you'll get alerted, one of your products will alert you, I've got a problem out on this machine. And so, traditionally a SOC would try to contact the owner of that machine, and a lot of times it's hard to track down who, especially in the larger corporation is, the harder it is to track down an asset. And then to actually get them to, now I need you to ship me your computer so we can do forensics analysis on it. So now they have to pull all the good data off of there. They need a new asset issued to them, and then forensics forensics has to wait for the asset to arrive, and then forensics can do their job. In the cases where the malware is actually captured with the event, none of that's required. They can just tell who's ever the on-site person responsible for the asset, blow your machine away, whatever your remediation process is. We already have the sample. We can take that sample, immediately put it in the hands of forensics, and forensics can go and do their job and say, go add this to the IDS, go add this to the firewall, go block these IP addresses, whatever the appropriate response is. So this goes back to, you don't have to grep through log files of your IDS and your firewalls, and it's not just the tedious nature of grepping through them, but it's having the knowledge of how they work and knowing that this event at this time lined up with this event at this timeline from a different product, which is lined up with this event from this timeline, and independently all of those seem pretty benign, but you have to have the knowledge, you have to be a subject matter expert in all those to correlate all those pieces of evidence into an actionable item, and then you can go start doing the track down and remediation process. So by able to and based on the metadata that's sent to us, we're immediately able to, in a lot of cases, our customers are immediately able to have source identification. They know the attack vector, what channel it came in on, and that's just more metadata that can either be helped to develop a new policy, to refine a policy, to put a defense in place. And the fact that we don't always have to that an asset doesn't always have to be ripped out of an employee's hand is obviously less disruptive to the employee, and the less you can disrupt your employees, obviously the less you disrupt your whole business cycle. And again, the fact that it's always on and always running SureView AMP, and SureView itself can provide the security regardless of your location. So at the end of the day, going back to the very first slide about the poor customer that had an asset out of country, off network. So they had this asset that was infected while it was out of country, and an AMP policy was triggered, which collected and stored the information. So when this asset connected back to the company's VPN, the alert and the associated data was sent back to the company's monitoring site. In this case, the associated data, the metadata, included a sample of the malware. So this is one of those cases where the customer was able to take the sample and immediately put it in forensics hands. This company's instant response was also able to then alert the end user that they had a problem that their AV didn't detect, and also they were able to trace the source of the infection. So they identified the attack vector, and it was such that they were able to identify and remediate through traditional means the initial attack vector, or the source of the initial attack vector. So this particular scenario for this customer is kind of wraps up all of the benefits that looking for malware behavior based and using the SureView product and its capabilities all wrap up together. And what could have been a very unfortunate day or incident for this particular company ended up being remediated and didn't disrupt the rest of whatever they were out of country trying to do. So that is the end of my presentation. Carolyn Ford is our marketing director for Oakley Systems. Her contact information is on the screen. If you have more if you want more information about SureView or AMP or how it's doing, feel free to contact her. And we're pretty much out of time. I could field one or two questions if you guys have them. Please.
So, you're talking about, anomaly detection, but the methods that you use were more deterministic. How are you, for anomaly detection, you need some kind of heuristics and statistical method approach that you go by.
Yeah, so initially we used what our knowledge base, right? Our own knowledge base, our own expertise, what we knew malware we were doing, our own decompositions. But we also can employ policies that look for anomalies or areas of where we suspect anomalous activity to occur, and then use the reporting feature then to find those anomalies. And once we find the enough discriminating information about the anomaly, then we can turn that into its own policy. So it's really iterative in that way.
So, when you speak about these policies, how are they actually developed? How are these policies actually modeled? Is there a heuristic model or is there a statistical model that you can bring back in?
You could do either. It's
But what does AMP do?
Currently we do statistic, and I wouldn't call it AMP in its infancy. It's kind of in its toddler stage, but we're definitely looking at ways that we do more dynamic-based anomaly detection on human behavior and how that can translate over into the malware space as well.
Any other questions? All right.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.